Hi there. Today is March 10th, 2026. The world stands in the shadow of a new geopolitical reality, following President Donald Trump's recent decision to launch a military strike on Iran. This action, which was purportedly a measure to deter Iran's nuclear ambitions and curb its influence in the Middle East, has instead ignited a wave of international criticism and domestic anxiety. The reverberations of this decision extend far beyond the immediate devastation, threatening to reshape alliances and provoke retaliation against American interests and citizens worldwide. This moment is particularly urgent due to the precarious position in which it places the United States on the global stage. The immediacy of this situation is significant. The consequences of Trump's decision are unfolding in real time, with global markets reacting with volatility and diplomatic relations with erstwhile allies strained. The strike has not only failed to achieve its purported objectives, but has also heightened tensions in a region already brimming with conflict. The narrative from the Trump administration is one of victory and strength, yet the reality appears different. The Iranian government, though initially caught off guard, has vowed to retaliate, potentially dragging the U.S. into a prolonged conflict that could spill over into other nations. Domestically, the decision has sparked a debate about the merits of unilateral military action and the long-term impacts on national security. Critics argue that this move was less about strategic necessity and more about deflecting attention from President Trump's ongoing legal challenges and declining approval ratings. The timing of the strike raises questions about the motivations behind such a dramatic show of force. Is this truly about neutralizing a threat, or is it an attempt to consolidate power and rally a fractured base? Credibility as a stabilizing global force is in jeopardy. Allies who once stood with America are reconsidering their alliances, wary of being dragged into a conflict that appears to lack a coherent endgame. The administration's actions have not only destabilized the Middle East further, but have also diminished America's moral authority to mediate disputes elsewhere. While Trump may declare victory and bring troops home, the seeds of discord have already been sown, and the specter of war looms over a weary world. The conventional wisdom surrounding President Trump's decision to bomb Iran is riddled with misconceptions and oversimplifications. The prevailing narrative, echoed by certain segments of the media and political commentators, suggests that this was a necessary step to curb Iran's growing influence and prevent it from becoming a nuclear-armed state. The administration contends that this decisive action will ultimately secure American interests and restore order in the Middle East. However, this perspective fails to account for the complex dynamics at play and the historical context that has shaped current relations. First and foremost, the assumption that bombing Iran would effectively dismantle its nuclear ambitions is fundamentally flawed. The history of military interventions aimed at halting nuclear programs is fraught with failure. Consider the Iraq War, where similar justifications were used to validate an invasion based on the pretext of weapons of mass destruction that were never found. Instead of achieving disarmament, these actions often served to strengthen the resolve of the targeted nation, bolstering nationalist sentiment and stoking anti-American fervor. Moreover, the notion that military force is the most effective means of addressing the Iranian threat ignores the potential for diplomatic solutions. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal, was a testament to the power of multilateral negotiations in curbing Iran's nuclear development. Though imperfect, it provided a framework for oversight and accountability, which was dismantled by the Trump administration's withdrawal in 2018. The idea that military intervention could replace the nuanced diplomacy of the JCPOA is not only naive, but also perilous. Another misconception is the belief that this strike will unequivocally enhance American security. In reality, the repercussions of such actions often manifest as increased instability and hostility. Iran's influence in the Middle East, while concerning to many, is not the monolithic threat it is often portrayed as. It operates within a complex web of regional politics, where alliances are fluid and motivations are manifold. By resorting to military force, the U.S. risks further entrenching Iran's hardline factions, weakening moderates who might have advocated for more peaceful relations. Furthermore, the portrayal of this strike as a show of strength belies the vulnerable position it places America in, both at home and abroad. The logic of deterrence through demonstration is mired in Cold War thinking, overlooking the asymmetric warfare tactics employed by Iran and its proxies. Retaliation might not come in the form of direct military engagement, but through cyber attacks, sabotage, and proxy conflicts, which are notoriously difficult to counter with traditional military might. The evidence against the efficacy of military strikes as a solution to complex geopolitical challenges is overwhelming and well documented. Historically, such actions have rarely resulted in lasting peace or stability. Instead, they often exacerbate existing tensions and sow the seeds of future conflicts. The Iraq War serves as a cautionary tale, where the promise of liberation quickly devolved into chaos and insurgency, leaving a fractured nation and a legacy of mistrust. In the case of Iran, the historical record highlights the resilience of its regime in the face of external aggression. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was, in part, a reaction to the West's manipulation and interference in its internal affairs. This historical context is crucial to understanding why military intervention is unlikely to achieve the desired outcomes. The Iranian population, despite internal dissent and dissatisfaction with their government, is likely to rally around their leadership in response to perceived foreign aggression. Furthermore, Iran's strategic alliances and proxy networks extend its influence well beyond its borders. Groups such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen are capable of launching retaliatory attacks that destabilize the region further. This interconnectedness means that any military action against Iran has the potential to trigger a broader conflict involving multiple parties. The evidence suggests that far from isolating and weakening Iran, military strikes often serve to galvanize its allies and expand its influence. Public reporting from the region highlights the immediate and devastating impact of the recent strike. Civilian casualties and infrastructure damage have sparked outrage among the international community. Humanitarian organizations on the ground report a dire need for aid and assistance as the conflict disrupts vital supply chains and displaces thousands. These reports underscore the human cost of military intervention, which is frequently glossed over in strategic discussions. Additionally, the evidence points to the miscalculation of international support. While some governments have offered tepid endorsements of America's right to defend itself, the broader consensus is one of concern and condemnation. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session to address the escalation, with several member states calling for restraint and diplomacy. This diplomatic isolation further erodes America's standing on the world stage and complicates efforts to forge a united response to global challenges. The real tension in this situation lies in the uncomfortable truth that military might cannot solve every geopolitical problem. This is a lesson taught repeatedly by history, yet often ignored in the heat of political posturing and national pride. The trade-off between immediate military action and long-term diplomatic engagement is stark. Yet, its complexity is often obfuscated by simplistic narratives of good versus evil, strength versus weakness. Central to this tension is the notion of sovereignty and the right of nations to self-determination. While the threat posed by Iran's nuclear ambitions and regional influence is a legitimate concern, the means by which these threats are addressed speak volumes about the values and principles guiding American foreign policy. The preference for unilateral military action reveals an aversion to the slower, more arduous path of diplomacy and negotiation. This impatience risks undermining the very international norms and institutions that the U.S. helped establish in the post-World War II era. The dilemma also extends to domestic politics, where the rhetoric of strength and security often masks the underlying political motivations. For President Trump, facing a barrage of legal challenges and dwindling support, the decision to bomb Iran provides a convenient distraction and an opportunity to project leadership. However, this political calculus comes at a cost, as it places American lives and interests in jeopardy. The allure of a quick fix can be politically tantalizing, but it rarely addresses the root causes of conflict or contributes to sustainable peace. Another facet of this tension is the economic implications of prolonged military engagement. The financial burden of war extends beyond the immediate costs of operations and munitions. It encompasses the long-term care of veterans, the reconstruction of damaged infrastructure, and the ripple effects on global trade and investment. As history has shown, these costs constrain national economies and divert resources away from pressing domestic needs. Finally, there is the moral dimension. The decision to engage in military action carries with it an ethical responsibility to consider the impact on civilian populations and the potential for unintended consequences. The history of warfare is littered with examples of misguided interventions that have resulted in humanitarian crises and regional instability. The moral imperative to protect human life and uphold international law must weigh heavily on the decision-makers who wield the power to wage war. If no changes are made to the current course, the consequences will be severe and far-reaching. The cycle of violence will likely continue, with retaliation and counter-retaliation becoming the norm. American citizens and interests worldwide will remain targets, as disgruntled factions seek to avenge perceived injustices. The once formidable influence of the United States on the global stage will be further diminished, as allies distance themselves from a nation perceived as reckless and untrustworthy. Economically, the strain of ongoing military engagement will be felt domestically. Resources that could be invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure will be diverted to sustain a conflict with no clear end in sight. The social fabric of the nation, already frayed by political division and economic disparity, will be tested further by the sacrifices demanded by war. In my view, the only viable path forward is a recalibration of American foreign policy towards diplomacy and multilateral engagement. This requires humility and a willingness to accept that military power alone cannot dictate global outcomes. The U.S. must work alongside international partners to address the root causes of instability, foster dialogue, and support initiatives that promote peace and security. Only then can the cycle of violence be broken and a more stable world order emerge. In conclusion, President Trump's decision to bomb Iran represents a significant misstep with potentially catastrophic consequences. It reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the complexities of international relations and a dangerous over-reliance on military solutions. If America is to reclaim its moral authority and preserve its security, it must abandon the path of unilateral aggression and embrace the challenging, yet ultimately more rewarding path of diplomacy. The stakes are high, and the time for change is now. I argue that the historical precedents and strategic miscalculations at play demand a more comprehensive understanding of these geopolitical dynamics. The decision to bomb Iran does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger pattern of American interventions that have often overlooked the intricate tapestry of regional politics. For instance, the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq serves as stark reminders of the unintended consequences that can arise from military engagements predicated on incomplete assessments and political expediency. Consider the Afghanistan conflict, which spanned 2 decades and consumed vast resources with limited success in achieving sustainable peace. Despite initial military victories, the long-term outcomes were marred by a resurgence of Taliban influence and a complex web of regional alliances that the U.S. struggled to navigate. Similarly, the invasion of Iraq, justified under the guise of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, resulted in regional destabilization, the rise of extremist groups like ISIS, and a protracted humanitarian crisis. These lessons from the past underscore the futility of relying solely on military might to resolve deeply entrenched geopolitical issues. The current course of action against Iran risks repeating these historical missteps. The complex matrix of regional power dynamics, sectarian divisions, and economic interests requires a nuanced approach that prioritizes dialogue and cooperation over aggression. Failing to adjust our strategy could lead to further entrenchment of Iran's influence, with its regional allies and proxy forces rallying in defiance of external pressures. This scenario is not mere speculation. It is a foreseeable consequence of overlooking the interconnected nature of Middle Eastern geopolitics, Moreover, if the U.S. persists in its path of confrontation without addressing the underlying causes of tension, we risk fostering further anti-American sentiment across the globe. This, in turn, would provide fertile ground for extremist narratives that exploit perceived injustices to fuel recruitment and radicalization efforts. The repercussions would not be confined to the Middle East, but would reverberate across continents, endangering American diplomatic missions, businesses, and citizens worldwide. The economic ramifications of prolonged military engagement cannot be ignored either. The financial burden of sustaining a conflict with Iran, coupled with potential disruptions to global oil supply routes, would have far-reaching impacts on both domestic and international markets. The strain on American taxpayers would be significant, diverting funds from critical public services and infrastructure projects that are essential for national resilience and prosperity. In essence, I believe that the decision to bomb Iran is emblematic of a broader failure to adapt to the evolving landscape of global politics. The challenges of the 21st century demand innovative solutions that transcend traditional paradigms of power projection. By acknowledging the limits of military intervention and committing to a policy of constructive engagement, the United States has the opportunity to restore its standing as a principled leader on the world stage. This is not merely a matter of strategic necessity, but a moral imperative to pursue peace and stability through means that reflect the values of justice and cooperation. As the consequences of inaction loom ever larger, the urgency for change becomes undeniable.